Portia opened her eyes slowly.
The spirits are restless tonight. The séance concluded not long after. The atmosphere left brittle and strained.
Tea was served in the conservatory.
Some guests attempted stiff conversation, others slipped away early. Beatrice was among the first to leave, her shawl hanging carelessly over her arm. Miss Marple lingered by a side table, stirring her tea without purpose. She observed Elise carrying the empty cups back toward the kitchen. She noticed Portia watching Elise with a flicker of distaste, and she noticed the faint tremor in Emmeline Sneed's hand as she reached for a biscuit.
It was not until morning that the village awoke to the true scandal.
Portia Wellborn was discovered dead in her bedroom. Not in dramatic disorder, no shattered furniture, no trace of forced entry. Her body lay curled beneath a paisley coverlet, her eyes closed, an empty glass on the bedside. A half-melted candle still flickered on the dresser.
The doctor pronounced it heart failure.
Miss Marple, after a slow walk along the dew-damp lanes and a few thoughtful stitches in her embroidery, thought otherwise.
She thought it was murder.
By the time the church bell struck 9 on the morning after the séance, little Skelton was already alive with whispers. It began, as such things often do, in the bakery queue, where Mrs. Tilling remarked, almost idly, that she had seen the constable pedalling toward Fern Hollow before breakfast. That alone made Mrs. Harvey forget her loaf entirely and lean forward, eyes wide. Before breakfast?
But surely that can't be routine.
No one ever hurries to Fern Hollow, not even the milkman. Unless, added the vicar's housekeeper, with the heavy emphasis of a stage actress, something dreadful occurred during that spirit-summoning nonsense.
That was all it took.
By mid-morning, 3 versions of Portia Wellborn's death had spread, one claiming ghostly possession, another whispering of poison hidden in candle wax, and the third, most popular of all, insisting she had been cursed by some Egyptian relic. Miss Marple, who gathered her knowledge less from gossip itself than from observing its effects, listened politely as Mrs. Lavinia Crothorne arrived at her doorstep, trembling with a sense of tragedy scarcely disguising her excitement. Of all the ridiculous fads, Lavinia muttered, accepting tea without thanks. Séances, incense, speaking to shadows. That woman meddled in things no decent Christian should touch. She did seem rather fond of theatrics, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Lavinia nodded vigorously, then faltered. Still, she didn't appear ill, did she? I mean to say, you saw her last night.
Nothing suggested a weak heart.
I'm no medical authority, Miss Marple replied, brushing a crumb from the saucer. But she poured her own tea steadily enough, and her eyes were sharp, when they weren't theatrically closed.
Lavinia sighed.
The doctor's calling it heart failure.
Poor man must be trying to avert scandal. Miss Marple did not answer. She simply refilled the teapot and glanced toward the road.
Elise, Portia's maid, was being led into the vicarage by Reverend Bartram. Her head was bowed, her dark braid hanging limp down her back. From that distance she looked younger than she had the night before, and more frightened too. By noon, Harold Greaves had been overheard at the Fox and Willow loudly declaring that séances were foreign foolishness, and that he had warned everyone trouble would come. Meanwhile, Mrs. Emmeline Sneed refused to leave her house at all. I heard she fainted when she heard, whispered Millicent Carroll, who claimed to have walked past the Sneed residence at precisely the right moment. Dorothea Crane, however, had been seen walking to the post office with unnerving composure. She posted a letter, exchanged a few polite words with Mr. Quibble, the stationer, and declined an invitation for tea from Mrs. Winterfred Trutt, an action which, in Little Skelton, was considered a silent proclamation of guilt or grief, or perhaps both. Miss Marple, meanwhile, wrapped her shawl and walked to the greengrocer's. She asked for plums and received pears, which she did not correct. She was more intent on noting who spoke to whom, and who carefully avoided doing so. Lionel Kent, the solicitor, stood outside his office, briefcase in hand, staring blankly at the brass plaque as though it had suddenly begun reciting Latin. His wife, a notoriously sharp woman with no taste for scandal, had arrived unexpectedly from Bath that morning, and the timing, as Miss Marple quietly noted, was peculiar.
It was equally peculiar that Elise had not yet returned to Fern Hollow.
At 4 o'clock, the constable made his second appearance that day, this time accompanied by Inspector Welsh from the larger nearby town of Heathmere. A stout, ruddy-cheeked man with a voice that made shutters quiver. Welsh was not a creature of subtlety. By supper, it was already widely whispered that Mrs. Wellborn's death was no longer being treated as natural. She was murdered then, gasped Lavinia, returning once more for tea. I wouldn't know, said Miss Marple, delicately lifting a biscuit. But I do know the doctor's certificate has been withdrawn. That's rather telling, don't you think?
Lavinia's fingers trembled.
And Elise?
Do you suppose she'll be blamed?
She was present, said Miss Marple simply, but so were many others, including ourselves. At that moment, a sharp knock broke the quiet of the cottage. When Miss Marple opened the door, she found young Constable Sims looking apologetic. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," he said, tugging his cap. "Inspector Welsh wonders if you'd be willing to speak with him." "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "Would you like a biscuit before we go? They're oat and ginger, very steadying for the nerves."
He blinked.
"Ah, thank you. But best we be quick." Inspector Welsh was waiting at the vicarage, having commandeered Reverend Bartram's study as a temporary command post. Papers and photographs already littered the tidy desk, to the vicar's quiet dismay. "Ah, Miss Marple," Welsh said, rising with surprising grace for a man of his girth.
"Do come in. We're hoping you might lend us a hand. Not officially, of course, just an extra pair of eyes."
"How kind," said Miss Marple, settling into the armchair nearest the hearth. "I suppose you've spoken with everyone who attended the séance."
"We've begun," Welsh replied. "But accounts don't quite match."
Elise swears she saw Miss Wellborn drink from her own glass and take a powder beforehand. Valerian root, apparently.
Others deny it. Mrs. Sneed, for instance, said nothing of powders.
She did mention, Miss Marple noted, accepting a cup of tea from the vicar, that the candles flickered violently when the name Marianne was spoken. "Who's Marianne?" asked Sims, still hovering in the doorway.
Welsh grunted. "That's the question. No record of any Marianne linked to Wellborn. Could be a ploy, could be nothing."
"Or," Miss Marple said gently, "it could be that someone in that room knew a Marianne and reacted when the name was spoken aloud."
Welsh raised a brow.
"You're suggesting someone betrayed themselves emotionally." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that the room grew colder not because of spirits, but because someone present suddenly remembered what they had tried very hard to forget." Welsh was silent for a moment, then leaned back.
"Right, then, we'll need to look into the Crane's past. Abroad too long for my liking."
"And perhaps," Miss Marple added, "you should ask Elise where Mrs. Wellborn purchased her valerian powder."
"It may not have been valerian at all."
As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple paused at the garden gate. The rusted hinge squealed softly as she opened it, a faint echo of Portia's spectral vision from the night before. "A garden gate," she murmured, half to herself. "A child weeping, and something buried. But who?" She walked home slowly, the lengthening shadows trailing behind her. The village still buzzed, but not with certainty, only with unease. The following morning dawned crisp and pale, the sky the color of skimmed milk, with a faint tang of smoke curling from the chimneys of Little Skelton.
It was the sort of day when everything seemed quiet.
Too quiet, Miss Marple thought as she passed the churchyard on her way to the grocer's. She was not doing any proper shopping, of course, just 2 eggs and a small loaf, bought more for appearance than for need. Her true purpose was to walk, to observe, and most importantly, to listen. At the counter she waited patiently behind Mrs. Hargrave, who was engaged in a loud quarrel with Mr. Quibble about whether the tomatoes had been properly stored. Behind them, Dorothea Crane stood silently, holding a single lemon, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Dorothea's shoes, brown suede, neatly kept, but the sole of the right one was damp, darkened by water not from the village roads.
The puddles there had long since dried.
"Lemon drizzle?"
Miss Marple asked pleasantly.
Dorothea startled, blinking.
"Oh, yes. Something like that."
"Such a comforting cake," Miss Marple murmured, "though it never keeps well unless wrapped in waxed paper." Dorothea gave a tight smile, nodded, and left without buying anything further. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned her attention to the others. The mood had shifted from speculation to defensiveness.
People were saying less, not more.
And in Miss Marple's view, that was when the truth began to seep through.
She encountered Reverend Bartram near the War Memorial. He was speaking with Lionel Kent, who looked visibly agitated. "You must understand," Kent was saying. "Mrs. Wellborn came to me just last week about amending her will. I told her it could wait until the following Monday.
I never expected. Well, did she say what sort of amendment?" Miss Marple asked gently, inserting herself into the conversation with the practiced ease of one long accustomed to it.
Kent hesitated. She intended to remove a beneficiary. She didn't say whom. Miss Marple gave a polite little nod.
That sort of thing can ruffle any number of feathers.
He glanced away.
Not that anyone knew.
She was quite secretive. Reverend Bartram cleared his throat delicately.
She also hinted to me she had received a threat, an anonymous letter.
But she wouldn't let me see it. Kent snorted.
Dramatics.
All that séance nonsense.
The whole affair was theatre. I wouldn't be surprised if she invented the threat simply to set the stage. Or, Miss Marple said softly, perhaps to test someone. She left them with a gentle farewell and turned toward the green. Something was beginning to itch at her thoughts, a pattern half seen, like embroidery stitches faintly showing through muslin.
At the far side of the green she found Elise.
The girl was seated beneath the lichen-covered sundial, arms folded tightly. Across her chest, her gaze fixed on the slow crawl of a beetle over the stone. You haven't gone back to Fern Hollow, Miss Marple said as she settled beside her.
No, Elise murmured. They said I could stay with the Cranstons for now. I can't sleep in that house again. Not after seeing her. Miss Marple waited.
She didn't look frightened, Elise said suddenly. That's the strange part. People spoke as if it were awful, but her face, she looked calm. As though she expected it, expected to die, or be taken, or simply slip away.
I don't know.
Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the beetle now climbing a blade of grass. Was she in the habit of taking valerian?
Sometimes, Elise said.
She claimed it helped her sleep, but she always added honey.
Said the taste was dreadful otherwise.
Did she take it the night of the séance?
Elise hesitated.
She poured it herself, from the little green bottle. But, her voice dropped. The bottle vanished afterward. I know where she kept it, and it isn't there now. Miss Marple's fingers paused in their quiet folding of her handkerchief. And did she usually measure it? Yes, 1 spoonful.
Always the same. But this time, I didn't see her use the spoon. Miss Marple gave her a kind look.
Thank you, Elise.
That may be more useful than you imagine.
As she walked back toward her cottage, her thoughts wandered, not to poisons, but to people. People, and the lies they told when frightened.
She had been at that séance.
She had seen Harold Greaves nearly spill his brandy when Portia spoke the name Marianne. She had seen Beatrice Fletton drop her glass. She had noticed Lionel Kent's sudden fascination with the floorboards when the candle flared violently. And she had marked Emmeline Sneed. Her hand had trembled as she reached for a biscuit, but not, Miss Marple suspected, from fear of ghosts. Back at home, she took up her knitting and let her fingers work automatically while her mind drifted.
Who was Marianne?
The name had been uttered only once. Portia had said it softly, as though it arrived unbidden, and in that instant the room had shifted. Not physically, but emotionally, a sharp intake of breath, a stiffness, a silence. She set her knitting aside and opened her bureau. At the bottom lay a slim leather-bound notebook in which she kept what she called her social observations. Not a diary, certainly not a journal, but fragments, impressions, things people said, and the manner in which they said them. She turned to her most recent entry, séance underlined in blue ink. Beneath the list of attendees she added, name spoken, Marianne.
Reactions multiple. Greaves startled. Fletton dropped glass. Sneed went pale. Kent silent.
Dorothea Crane unreadable. Elise unfamiliar with name. Then, in smaller script, who is afraid of Marianne, and why? That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Beatrice Fletton. The Fletton cottage was neat yet cluttered, filled with doilies and the lingering scent of lavender. Beatrice's mother, bedridden with a bad hip, called faintly from upstairs while Beatrice poured tea with hands that trembled ever so slightly. Miss Marple declined sugar and remarked conversationally, that was a dreadful business the other night. Beatrice flinched.
Yes. I wish I hadn't gone.
Séances do tend to provoke peculiar reactions, spirits or not.
Beatrice gave a brittle laugh.
I don't believe in any of that nonsense. Still, Miss Marple continued, when Miss Wellborn mentioned Marianne, such an uncommon name, your glass slipped.
Beatrice stiffened. Did it? Miss Marple smiled.
Perfectly understandable. Names do have a way of summoning memories, don't they?
Beatrice hesitated.
I knew a Marianne once, years ago, but it couldn't be the same.
It must be coincidence. Miss Marple tilted her head. Must it?
Beatrice gave no answer. She lifted the tea tray and stepped out for a moment, giving herself space to gather whatever composure she had nearly lost. When she returned, her smile was a shade too bright. "More tea, Miss Marple."
"No, thank you," Miss Marple replied.
"But I'm grateful for the conversation.
"It's been most enlightening."
As she stepped into the cool air, Miss Marple glanced toward the church steeple. The bell had not tolled since Portia's death. A mark of respect, or a silence carrying something far heavier. The pieces were coming slowly, like loose threads tugging to be drawn. Miss Marple could feel the pattern beginning to emerge beneath the surface, shapes forming in the weave. But someone in Little Skelton was working just as carefully to pull wool over everyone's eyes, and before long, she thought, someone else would stumble.
Chapter 4.
By Wednesday morning, Inspector Welsh had made up his mind. "We're focusing on Harold Greaves," he announced firmly, standing before a chalkboard hastily set up in the Reverend's low-ceilinged study. "Motive, personal dispute. Means, unconfirmed but likely. Opportunity, undeniable. Temperament," he tapped the word with his stub of chalk, "volatile." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, didn't interrupt. She rarely did in such moments, but she blinked slowly once and regarded the inspector with the mild interest of someone watching a child puzzle through a riddle. "You see," Welsh went on, "he's the only one who openly opposed the séance, shouted about it in the pub that very night. In fact, Portia Wellborn's death might have been a crime of passion.
Anger.
Intolerance. Perhaps he confronted her.
Perhaps it escalated.
Perhaps it went too far. But no signs of struggle," the Reverend offered hesitantly.
Welsh waved it aside. "Poison can be slipped into anything. Brandy, tea, or one of those powders she was always prattling on about. No struggle needed." Miss Marple laid her needles gently in her lap.
"And the name Marianne?"
Welsh frowned. "A distraction. Could have been invented. Portia was a showwoman. I'm not chasing phantoms.
I want facts." "Then I fear," Miss Marple said mildly, "you may be digging in the wrong garden bed." Welsh grunted but said nothing more. Outside, the village busied itself with unease. Gossip had grown teeth. By now, everyone knew Harold Greaves was the prime suspect. That afternoon, he was seen pacing the river path, hands jammed in his pockets, face flushed. Later, in the post office, he snapped at poor Mr. Quibble and stormed out without buying stamps.
Someone swore he had shouted about bloody hypocrites as he left.
Mrs. Hargrave declared she had always suspected him of something unsavory, though she could not say what. Even Mrs. Crowthorne, who once flirted shamelessly with Harold at a parish dance, now crossed the street to avoid him. Miss Marple, however, remained curiously unmoved. That evening she took her tea alone and laid her notebook open once more. She drew a circle at the center of the page and wrote Harold Greaves in neat block letters. Around him, she listed what she had observed, loud disapproval of séance. Unnerved when Marianne was mentioned. No evident personal link to Portia. Public temper. Yes. Private motive unknown. No known access to Portia's medicines. She tapped her pen once against the page and wrote, "Visible anger often conceals other feelings, but is it guilt or grief?" At sunset she walked to the village's edge, where Harold's cottage overlooked the bramble fields. He sat on the small bench by his gate, a bottle of stout at his side, a weathered pipe in hand. "Evening, Mr. Greaves," she said pleasantly. He didn't rise, but tipped his cap. "Evening, Miss Marple. Come to prod the angry bear?" "Certainly not. I came to check on a neighbor who seems to have been painted rather unfairly." He squinted at her. "You don't think I did it?" "I think you're a man who's lost something before," she said softly. "Your wife, wasn't it, during the influenza outbreak?" His eyes narrowed. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Only that those who've known grief often flare at faucets. And I wonder if something Portia said reminded you of someone you've tried not to recall." He sat silent for a long moment, staring at the pipe in his hands. "Marianne was my sister," he said at last. "Died when she was 17. Fell down the well behind the farm. Everyone called it an accident, but she never went near that well. Hated it. And you never spoke of this." "No one's business," he muttered. "It was 40 years ago. Hearing her name brought it all back, that's all. I've no idea how Portia could have known it." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That may be the most telling part of all." As she turned to leave, Harold called out, "I didn't like her, that's true.
But I'd never have harmed her.
Odd woman, yes, but no one deserves that. I quite agree, Miss Marple said over her shoulder.
The following day brought a surprise.
Dorothea Crane arrived at the vicarage with trembling hands and asked to see the inspector privately. 15 minutes later, the news ran through the village like fire on dry straw. Dorothea swears she saw Harold slip something into Portia's teacup just before the séance began, whispered Mrs. Crowthorne to half the village outside the butcher's. She was standing behind the curtain, saw it plain as day. But she was frightened, said she didn't want to be involved. Didn't want to be involved, muttered Mrs. Hargrave, until she had no choice. Miss Marple said nothing at first. But that afternoon she stopped by the vicarage again, this time to speak with Reverend Bartram.
Dorothea Crane is not a liar, she said gently.
But I don't believe she told the truth, either. The Reverend blinked. Then what do you suppose, Miss Marple?
I think Dorothea saw something, but not what she claims.
In a moment of fear, people often misread a gesture, and if already frightened, the mind fills in gaps. You think she was coached?
I think she may have been misled, Miss Marple replied.
Or perhaps she recalled something convenient rather than something true. That evening, as Miss Marple watched the mist curl back across the hedge, she considered the pliable nature of memory. Everyone longed for the crime to be simple.
A man with a temper. A woman with spiritual notions. An argument. Poison. Case closed.
But Miss Marple knew from long experience that truth often dressed in subtler clothing.
She sat at her desk and opened her notebook once more.
She drew a second circle. This one marked Dorothea Crane. Beneath it she wrote, claims to have seen Harold tamper with teacup.
Previously calm.
Why the change now?
Refused tea from Mrs. Trott the day after the death. Posted a letter the next morning. To whom?
Shoes, damp soles, garden, water, secret errand. No outward emotion during the séance, yet a reaction at the name Marianne. Another line scribbled, the pen pressing harder. Dorothea's husband, silent throughout.
Travels often. Why so unseen?
Then one final note for the night. Marianne's name meant something to more than one person.
Harold reacted. Beatrice reacted. Dorothea reacted. Miss Marple closed the book.
The inspector might be hurtling after Harold Greaves with all the drive of a foxhound on scent. But Miss Marple, with her gentle hands and unhurried step, was moving toward another kind of answer. The kind that doesn't bark but stirs, that creeps in quiet corners, that waits in words left unspoken. And somewhere in Little Skelton, that answer was about to be unsettled. Rain drifted down softly that Thursday morning, a fine misting drizzle that blurred the hedges and gave the lanes of Little Skelton a silver sheen. Miss Marple, having finished her porridge and tended her canary, fetched her mackintosh and umbrella and set out with composed calm. She had no fixed destination.
That was the trick, really.
Appear not to be searching, and you'll discover more than if you look as though you are. She wandered first to the churchyard, then along the lane by the grocer's, and finally, as though remembering it suddenly, down the back path to Fern Hollow.
The house had been locked since Portia's death.
But Elise, still lingering in the village and still afraid, had agreed to meet her by the garden gate. She said she kept everything neat.
Elise whispered as she pressed a small brass key into Miss Marple's hand.
But that last day she was restless, moved things about, left her brooch out on the writing desk, which she never did.
And I found this.
From her coat pocket she drew a folded paper napkin.
Inside lay a button.
Black, flat, ordinary, except for a curious silver notch along the rim. Where was it?
Under the dresser, Elise said. In her room.
I thought it belonged to one of my cardigans, but I checked. It's not mine. Miss Marple turned the button over in her gloved palm. It doesn't match anything Portia wore at the séance, she said softly.
And she wouldn't have been crawling under furniture. But someone might have dropped it.
Or knelt, Elise breathed. Knelt, perhaps, to slip something into a teacup, Miss Marple said gently. Or to remove something from the room.
She thanked the girl and slipped the button into her handbag.
With Elise's key and no eyes upon her, she let herself quietly into Fern Hollow. The house was cool, still, undisturbed. The faint scent of incense clung to the drapes. She moved slowly through the drawing room, eyes scanning the placement of chairs, the fall of drapery, the candles that had guttered low and left waxy petals across the black velvet table. It was in the writing room, Portia's study, truly, that Miss Marple paused. On the desk lay a single sheet of cream-colored paper, half hidden beneath a leather blotter. Not a letter.
Not quite. More list.
She tilted her head. Names, dates, notes. She read, Marianne Greaves, 1886.
Accident or not. Dorothea Crane. Correspondence from Marrakesh. Check dates. Lionel Kent.
Will revisions discussed privately? Emmeline Sneed. Husband's heart attack, unusual. Confirm Dr. Penrose's timeline. Beatrice, mother's financial dependence. A chill ran through her. Portia had been compiling something, a private inquiry not of spirits, but of secrets. She glanced again at the button in her handbag, then turned toward the fireplace.
Something felt wrong.
The rug, a heavy Persian carpet, normally aligned and precise, was slightly askew, its corner curled where it should have lain flat. Miss Marple knelt, ignoring the protest of her knees, and tugged it straight. Beneath the rug, tucked along the seam of the floorboards, rested a small brown vial, empty. Miss Marple rose slowly, brushing her skirt smooth. Her expression remained unreadable. The vial matched nothing from the medicine cabinet upstairs. Not valerian, not anything Elise would have touched, and it had been hidden far too carefully to be merely misplaced. She locked the house again without notice and returned directly home. That afternoon she requested a meeting with Inspector Welsh. 2 matters, Inspector, she said as she settled into his office at the vicarage. First, I discovered an item you may wish to test for traces of any unusual substance.
She placed the small brown vial on his desk. He raised his brows.
Where did you? In the fireplace, she answered truthfully, if not completely. Concealed beneath the rug. Not the sort of thing one finds by chance, wouldn't you say? And the second? This, she said, laying Portia's list gently before him. Welsh read it once, then again.
His expression darkened.
She had dirt on everyone, he muttered. She had interest in everyone, Miss Marple corrected softly. There's a distinction. Some of these notes suggest she was watching for patterns, inconsistencies. Not gossip, Inspector, curiosity.
Welsh leaned back.
So someone killed her to keep her from sharing what she knew, or what she might have known. And that, Miss Marple added, is a far more dangerous motive. Welsh tapped the list with his finger.
This alters everything.
Harold may have reacted emotionally to that name, but he would not have known Portia was collecting information about the others.
He doesn't move in those circles.
Precisely. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with her embroidery, listening to the wind rise outside. Her thoughts turned not to speculation, but to confirmation.
She had seen the fishes.
The button had opened the first door. The list had opened the second. And now one question lingered at the edge of her mind. Who knew Portia's habits well enough to slip through her room, perhaps during the séance itself, and plant or remove something unseen? She thought again of Dorothea, of her sudden testimony, her damp-soled shoes the morning after the séance, the hastily posted letter.
Then she thought of Lionel Kent. He had access to Portia's legal affairs, her will, her finances. He knew where things were kept.
And yet he had seemed oddly nervous that morning, not after the death, but before suspicion had even been raised.
Miss Marple opened her notebook once more and drew a symbol, a circle within a square. Fern Hollow. Inside the circle, she wrote only 2 names. Dorothea saw something she did not understand, or misunderstood entirely.
Lionel, knowledge of will, evasive, overly precise, avoids emotional questions. Then, beneath in her fine looping hand, button, too plain for Portia, too feminine for Greaves. Matches Kent's overcoat.
Must confirm. Vial, not Elise's, not from cabinet. Could have come from Kent's own satchel.
Legal men carry more than pens. The village would sleep uneasily that night, lulled into believing Harold Greaves stood at the storm center. But Miss Marple knew tempests often spun outward from far quieter places, and someone, somewhere, had dropped a button hastily, carelessly, in thoughtless haste. A mistake so small, so ordinary, that no one else had even noticed.
But Miss Marple had.
By Friday, the mood in Little Skelton had grown brittle. The village was no longer whispering about Portia Wellborn's death. It had begun hardening opinions into something that looked uncomfortably like certainty. Unfortunately, those certainties shifted with every conversation. At the grocer's, Harold Greaves was still eyed with muted suspicion, though the weight of gossip had started to scatter. The discovery of the list Miss Marple had found, discreetly shared by Inspector Welsh with only a few key figures, had complicated matters. Why would she keep a list like that, muttered Mrs. Hargrave over her apples. Like some sort of spy.
She was a spiritualist, said Mr. Quibble, frowning.
They take notes.
It's all about reading people.
No, said Lavinia Crothorn with sudden clarity.
Portia wasn't reading them. She was recording them.
The implication was unmistakable. Portia had secrets, and more crucially, she had other people's secrets. And secrets, Miss Marple knew, were Little Skelton's true currency. Later that morning, she received an unexpected visit from Beatrice Fletton. The girl looked paler than usual, her hands twisting nervously at the strap of her handbag. She refused tea, but accepted a ginger biscuit, nibbling it with the fragile unease of someone uncertain whether to eat or cry.
I
needed to ask you something, Beatrice said at last, about Portia. Miss Marple set her knitting aside.
Go on, dear. She said something to me the week before the séance. About inheritance. Miss Marple's brows lifted faintly. Did she?
She said, jokingly, I thought, that people often pretend to be someone they are not when money is involved. Then she looked at me and said, Your mother's been cleverer than most.
I didn't know what she meant.
Did your mother know Portia well? No, Beatrice said, flushing.
But she's been short of money, and Portia was wealthy.
I suppose I wondered, she trailed off. The implication lingered, unspoken. But Miss Marple had already begun to shape a conclusion.
Did your mother know Mr. Kent? Beatrice hesitated.
They both served on the same charity committee years ago, before her hip made going out difficult.
Miss Marple nodded.
I wonder, dear, if your mother may have sought assistance in ways you did not know. Beatrice said nothing, but her trembling hand reached instinctively for another biscuit. Later, as Miss Marple walked toward the green, she found Inspector Welsh pacing with his familiar furrowed brow.
Dora's recanting, he muttered.
Says she may have been mistaken about what she saw Harold doing with the teacup.
Claims it all happened too quickly.
Fear can twist memory, Miss Marple said gently.
Or guilt,
Welsh snapped, then exhaled sharply.
We've spoken with Kent again. He swore he hadn't seen Portia the week before she died.
But now we've got Elise saying she brought him through the back door that very Monday.
Ah, Miss Marple murmured. The back door. That's always where the true stories lie.
Still no trace of the missing bottle, Welsh continued. But the lab confirms residue in the vial you gave me contained powdered belladonna.
Lethal in high doses. Not valerian at all. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed.
Then Portia was murdered, and someone took great pains to conceal it. More than pains, Welsh said darkly. Premeditation. Miss Marple looked out across the green. Did you ask Kent why he visited Portia that day?
He claimed it was to advise her on tax filings. Said nothing unusual occurred.
Did he admit knowing about the change in her will?
He denies it. Says he never saw the revised draft.
Miss Marple pressed her lips together. How convenient. That afternoon brought another visitor, this time to her cottage. Emmeline Sneed arrived unannounced, clutching a shawl and a small velvet pouch. I can't keep it any longer, she said, pressing the pouch into Miss Marple's hand. I should have spoken sooner.
I was afraid. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside lay a locket, gold, edges worn thin.
Within was a photograph of a man and a woman, Portia, and someone faintly familiar. That was my husband, Emmeline said softly.
Cornelius. Miss Marple's eyes met hers.
I thought he passed from a heart attack last spring.
He did, Emmeline whispered. But not naturally. Portia knew.
She sent me this locket before she died, told me to prepare for unpleasant truths.
That's how she put it. I think she suspected me.
Miss Marple set the locket on the tea tray. Did you give Cornelius belladonna? No, Emmeline breathed.
But I believe someone else did. Someone who wanted both him and Portia gone. Someone who profited from their deaths. She turned her face aside.
Cornelius handled Kent's financial matters. He saw irregularities, but never acted.
He said Lionel was useful. And Portia, she told him she was revising her will.
Said she'd left something for me.
She thought I deserved it. Cornelius was furious. He thought she owed him. Miss Marple folded her hands.
Did he ever tell you what Portia knew about him?
Never.
But I think Kent might have, or used it.
That night, Miss Marple reviewed her notes again.
She added a new section. Cornelius Sneed, sudden death in spring.
Portia's locket sent to Emmeline. Implied knowledge. Kent equals common link.
Access to Portia's legal papers and Sneed's accounts.
Portia altered will. Kent claimed ignorance.
Elise confirmed secret meeting.
Kent equals pressure point.
New secrets, possible exposure feared. Her gaze lingered on one phrase, someone profited from both deaths.
Kent was not loud. He was not reckless.
But he was careful, measured, and everyone who drew too near the truth ended up silenced. Everyone except Miss Marple.
Not yet.
The sun rose through a gauze of mist the next morning, making the trees around Little Skelton look ghostly, half-formed. It was the kind of morning when the village stirred slowly, uncertain whether to believe in light or in fog. Miss Marple was preparing her tea when the knock came, not the gentle tap of a neighbor, but a sharp, urgent pounding that startled her canary into flight. At the door stood Inspector Welsh, red-faced and tight-lipped. "I need you at Fern Hollow, Miss Marple. There's been another incident." Within 10 minutes she was once again inside the ivy-clad house, the parlor now stripped of its séance trappings. A constable stood by the open window, his notebook damp from the drizzle. Welsh led her to the back study, where Elise sat pale and trembling on a floral settee. "There was a break-in," Welsh muttered. "During the night. No signs of forced entry, but Elise swears she locked every door." "I did," the girl whispered, her eyes flicking toward the shadowed corners.
"I always check twice." Miss Marple eased herself beside her.
"What was taken?"
Elise swallowed. "Not money, not jewelry, just papers."
"The folder from the writing desk, the one kept locked." "The folder that held her notes?"
Miss Marple asked quietly. Elise nodded.
"And the second will?" Welsh said, pacing.
"We've been looking for it."
Kent insisted it hadn't been finalized, but if Portia kept a draft, Miss Marple folded her hands. Then someone knew precisely where to find it. They knew Elise was staying with the Cranstons last night.
They knew the house would be empty.
"And they took only the folder," Welsh muttered.
"Not even the silver candlesticks." Miss Marple rose deliberately.
"Inspector, may I examine the window?"
It was open just an inch. No scratches on the latch. No footprints in the flowerbed below.
"A practiced hand," she murmured. "Or someone with a key." Welsh turned to Elise. "You're certain it was locked?"
"I heard a noise. That's why I came early. I found the drawer open. The folder gone."
Miss Marple gazed into the grey garden, her expression thoughtful. "May I speak with Lionel Kent?"
Welsh shot her a sharp look.
"You think he?" "I think," she said evenly, "that a solicitor who claims not to have seen a second will may have every reason to ensure it remains unseen." Lionel Kent was in his office, a neat red brick building at the edge of the village square. When Miss Marple arrived, he received her with his usual distant courtesy.
"Miss Marple, how may I assist you?" She offered a pleasant smile.
"I had a small matter to clarify regarding Mrs. Wellborn's revised will."
He blinked.
"As I told the inspector, no such will ever cross my desk." "No," she said gently, "but it was discussed, on the Monday before her death. Elise confirmed she brought you in through the back entrance."
His face twitched.
"She may be mistaken."
"I don't think so," Miss Marple replied.
"In fact, I believe Portia entrusted you with a draft, one she intended to finalize, removing a beneficiary, was it not?" "I don't see the relevance." "The relevance," Miss Marple said softly, "is that Portia died 2 days later, and the only document that could contradict the present legal record has now disappeared." Kent leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. If there had been such a document, and I am not saying there was, it might not have carried legal weight. "But it would have implied motive," she said, her voice still gentle. "If, for instance, you stood to lose something in that second version." He regarded her for a long moment before offering a thin smile. "That would be quite the tale, wouldn't it?" Miss Marple inclined her head and quietly took her leave. Back at her cottage, she studied her notes once more. The suspects no longer circled endlessly. They converged, the missing button, the stolen vial, the secret visit, and now the break-in. Each clue carried its own weight, and together they drew toward a single name. Yet something remained absent. That evening, as the rain fell harder, Dorothea Crane arrived unannounced. She was unsettled, her usual poise frayed.
"I'm worried about Martin," she blurted.
"He's changed."
"In what way?" "He's restless."
short-tempered. He told me I should stay out of the investigation, that I'd already made things worse.
Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands.
You were frightened, Dorothea.
There's no shame in that.
Dorothea shook her head.
But I didn't imagine it. I did see something during the séance.
It wasn't Harold, it was a man leaning forward. I thought perhaps Martin, but I couldn't let myself believe it.
She stopped, eyes wide.
Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. Often, what we resist believing is exactly what we must consider. I don't know what to do. Miss Marple's tone was calm, quiet.
Trust your instincts.
And trust that truth will surface, especially when someone works too hard to bury it. After Dorothea left, Miss Marple sat in stillness.
The pieces were nearly aligned. But a new question rose. Had Martin Crane known of Portia's second will?
Dorothea's hesitation, Martin's anger, his urgency to silence her, and where had he been the night of the break-in? The next morning, a final twist arrived. A constable came to Miss Marple's door with a folded letter. Delivered anonymously.
We thought you should see it. She opened it slowly.
No signature, just neat block print.
There is something buried behind the well at Fern Hollow.
Ask Elise.
Ask her what she saw that morning.
Miss Marple blinked once, then rose to fetch her coat. The morning after the anonymous letter, Miss Marple returned to Fern Hollow, her resolve stitched tighter than her neatest embroidery threads. The air was sharp, the earth damp beneath her sensible boots. At the far end of the garden, past the tangle of dead hydrangeas, beneath a leaning iron trellis, stood the old well, sealed with a rusted grate, half-choked in ivy. The same well Portia had vaguely mentioned during the séance, a garden gate, a child's cry, something hidden. And now Miss Marple stood before it, hands folded neatly, eyes narrowing on the ground beyond. Elise arrived soon after, summoned by a polite note. She approached hesitantly, cardigan wrapped tight around her shoulders. You said you wanted to see the garden, she asked softly.
Miss Marple nodded.
You came early the morning after Mrs. Wellborn's death, didn't you? Yes.
I thought I heard something in the night. I hardly slept.
And you came by the back way.
Elise nodded again.
I always take the shortcut, it runs through the hedge behind the vicarage. Did you notice anything unusual?
Elise hesitated. Only that someone had passed through the flower beds.
Footprints, and
something half-buried. Miss Marple turned to face her fully.
Go on. There was a scarf, Elise whispered. Half-buried in the soil.
It had been trampled into the ground.
I thought perhaps a fox had dragged it from the rubbish heap. Do you still have it?
I put it behind the shed.
I was frightened.
Miss Marple offered the faintest smile.
You've been very brave, Elise. Let's take a look. Behind the shed, Elise produced a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside lay the scarf, silk, pale blue, faintly perfumed. Soil stained the fabric, along with something darker, either rust or dried blood.
Sewn into the hem was a name tag, M. Crane.
Miss Marple refolded the scarf with care. I believe this may be exactly what we need.
That afternoon she called upon Inspector Welsh.
We must proceed with caution, she said,
laying the scarf on his desk. Someone is watching closely. They've already stolen evidence once. They may try again.
Crane?
Welsh asked grimly.
I suspect so. But we cannot accuse him, not yet. He won't confess, he's too careful.
But he will react.
You've a plan, then?
A very small one, she replied mildly.
All we need is a touch of theatre. That evening, Miss Marple ensured whispers travelled by deliberate paths. Lavinia Crowthorne murmured to Mrs. Harvey, who mentioned it to the stationer, who passed it to the grocer, who confided in Dorothea Crane. Within 2 hours, all of Little Skelton knew that evidence had been unearthed near the well.
No one said what kind. No one needed to. The suggestion alone unsettled the air. The next morning Miss Marple invited Dorothea to tea.
She arrived subdued, hands clasped tight in her lap, her face pale and hollow.
Is it true? She asked softly.
About the well?
There was something, Miss Marple said gently. A scarf. Dorothea flinched.
Martin's. I believe so. Dorothea lowered her eyes, fingers tightening. He said he'd gone walking that night, couldn't sleep. But when he came in, he smelled of wet earth.
Asked him, and he shouted.
I didn't press.
Miss Marple poured the tea.
You must be very frightened.
She nodded faintly.
And yet, Miss Marple continued, you came here all the same. I needed someone to listen, Dorothea whispered, before everything unravels. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the green as Martin Crane crossed toward her.
His smile stretched a little too wide.
Miss Marple, he said smoothly, I hear there's been some excitement.
Only a trifle, she replied.
A garden scrap. I do hope people aren't leaping to conclusions.
People often do, she said.
But conclusions are curious things.
They need more than gossip. They require conduct. He tilted his head.
And whose conduct are we observing now? Oh, she answered lightly. Everyone's. That night, the vicarage received a report of a disturbance came in. A figure had been spotted in Fern Hollow's back garden, crouched near the well. When Welsh and Constable Sims arrived, they discovered Martin Crane beside the trellis, his coat caked with mud, his hands unsteady. I was looking for my scarf, he said smoothly. Dorothea noticed it had gone missing. In the dark?
Welsh asked.
It held sentimental value. From the path, Miss Marple observed quietly.
And such haste to reclaim it.
Curious, isn't it?
Martin's eyes flickered.
Am I under arrest?
Not yet, Welsh replied.
But would like you to come to the station. Miss Marple turned back toward the gate, her expression unreadable.
The snare had sprung, but she knew the truth was not yet whole.
Murder rarely begins with rage.
It begins with fear.
And Martin Crane, for all his composure, had just shown he was afraid. Chapter 9. Martin Crane sat across from Inspector Welsh in the vicarage study, his brow furrowed, his damp coat steaming faintly in the glow of the coal fire. Outside, the rain returned, soft, insistent, and strangely fitting.
It made Little Skelton seem as though it had stopped breathing.
Miss Marple stood at the hearth, her shawl folded neatly over her arm, her gaze calm yet sharp as needles. Would like you to explain, Welsh said flatly, why you were in the Fern Hollow garden last night, muddy, alone, and hunting a scarf you never reported missing.
Martin leaned back.
I told you.
Dorothea mentioned it. I thought I'd check.
You chose to visit a locked estate in the dark.
Miss Marple asked mildly. How considerate.
He said nothing. Welsh leaned forward. We also have a scarf, Mr. Crane.
Found buried. Stained. Soiled. Bearing your name. Hidden by the well. Martin's jaw tightened.
Planted. Then you'll have no objection to us comparing it with your wardrobe?
Miss Marple asked. He looked away.
I must confess, she continued, at first I wondered if it was you or Lionel Kent.
But then I recalled something Portia said.
Welsh frowned. You never mentioned Portia said anything of note.
She didn't at the time, not directly, but it returned to me.
During the séance, she spoke of a rusted gate, of a woman buried behind the garden.
At first, I thought it melodrama. But Portia was never as fanciful as she liked to appear. Martin scoffed.
You're basing your charge on séance mutterings.
No, Miss Marple replied evenly.
I'm basing it on conduct, on timing, and on fear.
She turned to Welsh.
Let us begin, shall we?
Welsh gestured.
Go on.
Miss Marple stepped into the center of the room.
Portia Wellborn came to Little Skelton not to stage séances, but to observe. She was, in her own fashion, an investigator.
Her notes confirm it.
She gathered details about various villages, including Lionel Kent and Emmeline Sneed's late husband. But what intrigued her most was the Cranes. From the corner, Dorothea swallowed audibly. Martin Crane had known Portia before, not closely, but through business. Years ago he was tied to an investment gone awry, a firm entangled in misused funds. Portia, I believe, recognized him from that.
She began to watch him, quietly.
Her notes mention Marrakesh, where the Cranes once lived, and letters Dorothea sent that never reached their destination.
Martin rose abruptly.
This is absurd.
Miss Marple lifted a hand.
Please, Mr. Crane.
Indulge me.
He sank back into his chair, stiffly. She also amended her will, Miss Marple continued. According to Elise and Emmeline Sneed, she intended to dismiss Kent as her solicitor and appoint a new beneficiary, one we now believe to be Emmeline herself. She confided this to a few, and that is when the danger began. She turned to Welsh. Inspector, the poisoned valerian vial was planted cleverly, but only afterward. Someone entered the room during, or immediately after, the séance and placed it there. We now know it contained belladonna, not valerian. Elise confirmed Portia never measured her dose that evening, as was her custom.
It had already been altered.
And who had that access? Welsh pressed.
Miss Marple turned her gaze. Martin Crane.
He slipped away in the séance, likely during a dramatic moment, when eyes were shut or half-closed. He placed the tainted powder in Portia's teacup, or had already done so, then restored the original vial later to maintain the guise of natural death.
Martin gave a derisive snort.
You can't prove any of this.
No, Miss Marple replied evenly.
But you tried to recover the scarf. A small, careless misstep.
You wore it that night.
The same one Elise found buried, clumsily hidden near the garden well.
A token of your haste.
Had you left it, perhaps it would have gone unnoticed. But fear, Mr. Crane, is a ruthless master. Especially for men such as yourself, controlled, precise, calculating. The notion of leaving a trace was intolerable.
Welsh leaned in. And the break-in. The second will. Miss Marple inclined her head.
Yes.
Martin, Dorothea was away that night.
The house empty.
He knew where the draft was kept.
He had heard Portia mention it to Kent, perhaps even glimpsed it himself, and he destroyed it.
Martin rose once more, voice taut.
You're stitching fantasy from fragments. You've no confession, no proof.
Miss Marple met his eyes.
But you will confess, Mr. Crane. Because Dorothea has already begun to doubt you. And fear, as I have said, spreads.
All eyes turned.
Dorothea looked at Martin, truly looked at him, for the first time. You told me Portia was dangerous, she said softly.
That she would ruin us. But she only ever tried to help.
Dorothea, he stood. You told me we could not return to Marrakesh, that it was unsafe, that we were followed. But it wasn't safety you feared, it was exposure. Martin's mouth opened, closed, his fists tightening. I was trying to protect us, he said hoarsely. Everything we built, everything I rebuilt, she threatened to destroy.
For what? Some hollow virtue.
You killed her, Dorothea whispered. Didn't you? Martin glanced around the room, his face void. Then, slowly, he nodded. I didn't mean to, not at first, he muttered. But when she spoke of the will, of Emmeline, I knew I was already cut out.
I had nothing left. And she would expose me. He lifted his eyes to Miss Marple.
How did you know it was me? She stepped closer. Because you tried too hard not to be seen. And only the guilty dread attention before a single question is asked. The confession silenced the room. Martin Crane hunched forward on the edge of the vicarage study chair, no longer defiant, merely resigned. Dora stood at the window, arms folded, her eyes red but unreadable. Inspector Welsh had yet to move, his expression granite. And Miss Marple, seated serenely by the hearth, gave the faintest nod before she spoke. I think, she said gently, it is time to set everything out plainly. Welsh cleared his throat. Please, Miss Marple, let's hear it straight through.
She folded her hands in her lap, her tones soft yet deliberate.
The heart of this case was never the act of murder itself. It was the behavior before and after. That is where the truth lived, not in teacups or séance theatrics, but in choices made under strain. Her gaze shifted toward Dorothea, not unkindly.
Portia Wellborn's death seemed natural.
A woman, peaceful in her bed, no sign of violence. Yet even then, the details betrayed it. Her usual valerian dose was unmeasured. The bottle vanished, only to be replaced later.
That was not panic, but planning.
And the vial Elise discovered in the fireplace proved the powder was not valerian at all, but belladonna. Welsh inclined his head. Poisoning by someone who knew her routines.
Precisely, Miss Marple replied.
And by someone close enough, and bold enough, to act unseen, during the séance, when attention wavered and eyes were closed.
That narrowed matters at once.
She turned toward Martin, though her voice stayed gentle.
You knew Fern Hollow's layout.
You played the passive observer, slipping away when you pleased. Your calm afterward, too smooth, too detached, marked you. You inserted yourself just enough, never fully. Martin said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor. But the true trail, Miss Marple continued, lay in your silences. You never objected when suspicion fell on Harold Greaves. You never once asked who stood to gain from Portia's altered will. You showed no reaction to her notes being found.
She turned to Welsh.
Recall Mr. Crane's alibi, the restless wandering, the vague walks, his evasions about Portia's legal revisions.
He denied everything, Welsh muttered.
And yet, Miss Marple pressed on, we know Elise saw Kent enter Fern Hollow secretly on Monday.
Portia likely told him of the will, and of her doubts about Martin.
Kent, flawed though he is, took no action.
But Martin did.
Why not Kent?
Welsh asked.
He had motive. Indeed, Miss Marple said. But Kent is a strategist, not a gambler. His guilt lay in omission, not commission. He withdrew, hoping the matter would fade or Portia's resolve would weaken. Martin Crane, however, is another breed. He feared not only the loss of inheritance, but exposure, his Marrakesh dealings, his fraudulent investments, perhaps even his hand in Cornelius Sneed's suspicious death.
All of it threatened to surface. A stir from Dorothea.
She swallowed hard, though remained silent. Portia may not have possessed proof, Miss Marple continued, but her suspicion was enough to frighten him. When she hinted she would alter her will, perhaps to Emmeline Sneed, perhaps even to Dorothea, Martin acted, and swiftly.
The scarf, Welsh murmured.
Miss Marple inclined her head.
A careless slip.
Dropped near the well during his hurried attempt to retrieve or destroy the revised draft. He later tried to recover it, but Elise had already noticed the half-buried scrap. And the anonymous letter I received likely came from someone who glimpsed him that morning, or guessed the truth, and feared it would be overlooked.
Dorothea? Welsh asked, but she shook her head. No, Dorothea whispered.
I didn't write anything.
I only saw how frightened he was. Miss Marple's voice softened.
And fear, as we've said, is most revealing. It draws out truth more surely than any confrontation.
She turned back to Martin.
Even your attempt to throw suspicion on Harold, through Dorothea's false memory, was born of that fear. You nudged her gently, urged her to recall what she had never seen. But guilt cannot hide forever.
Not here. Not in Little Skeleton.
A long silence settled over the room.
At last, Martin spoke.
She was going to ruin everything, he muttered. Not only the inheritance, the past.
Dorothea and I rebuilt our lives after Marrakesh.
We escaped, and Portia was dragging us back into it. You had a choice, Dorothea said quietly, her voice steady now. You always had a choice.
He did not answer.
Welsh rose to his feet. Martin Crane, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Portia Wellborn. You'll be charged formally once the evidence is submitted.
Do you understand?
Martin Crane nodded once and allowed himself to be led away.
The door closed firmly behind him.
Dorothea remained at the window, motionless.
Miss Marple stood and approached her gently.
Would you care for a cup of tea, my dear? Dorothea managed a faint, weary smile.
Yes, I think I would. They moved into the vicarage kitchen.
The kettle had just begun to whistle. The village of Little Skeleton did not erupt into scandal after Martin Crane's arrest.
It recoiled.
People moved more quietly, spoke more softly. No one uttered his name aloud. Not in the butcher's queue, nor behind shuttered curtains. A veil had fallen across the lanes and hedgerows. A silent pact that tragedy, when it struck so near, must not be prodded. The official proceedings came quickly. Martin offered no defense.
His signed confession was enough.
Inspector Welsh travelled to Heathmere with a complete file of evidence, the scarf, the charred remnants of the will from the fireplace grate, the forensic report on the belladonna vial, all neatly catalogued. The authorities had what they required. Yet justice, Miss Marple knew, seldom ended with a trial. It lingered, in glances, in echoes, in altered morning routines. Dorothea Crane left the cottage within a week.
She spoke little to anyone.
Miss Marple saw her once at the station, a small trunk and single hat box at her side. They exchanged no words, only a long look and a gentle nod. Beatrice Fletton, once pale and timid, grew more withdrawn. She visited her mother daily but was rarely seen elsewhere. Rumour held that she had written to an aunt in Devon, seeking a lengthy stay. Lionel Kent, though spared legally, endured his own quiet punishment. Clients withdrew, polite but firm. His brass nameplate dulled. The scandal brushed too close, and in Little Skeleton, proximity itself was guilt. As for Emmeline Sneed, she stayed hidden behind her curtains. No longer feared, no longer whispered about, yet never fully trusted either. Too many secrets still lingered from her late husband's affairs. Too many shadows clung. One afternoon, Lavinia Crothorne joined Miss Marple for tea and voiced what many were thinking.
"It's odd," she said, dabbing her lips. "How things seem almost unchanged.
The same hedges, the same vicar's sermons, the same gooseberry jam at Mrs. Hargrave's. And yet, there's something beneath it," Miss Marple said softly.
Lavinia nodded.
"As though the whole village is holding its breath."
"It is," Miss Marple replied.
"Because truth unsettles far more than any lie ever could."
Lavinia studied her a moment.
"You knew all along, didn't you?"
"I suspected," Miss Marple admitted. "But I needed Martin to betray himself.
The cleverer the killer, the more invisible their guilt becomes.
But fear always unmasks them in the end."
"The end," Lavinia murmured, sipping her tea. "I do hope it brings peace."
"No," Miss Marple said gently. "It brings understanding."
"That is quite different." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her armchair beside the hearth, her knitting idle on her lap. She thought not of justice, but of consequence, not of the bold act, but of its quiet ripples. Portia Wellborn had come to Little Skeleton a stranger. She had stripped away its facade, glimpsed what lay beneath, and paid for that vision with her life. And yet, in her strange, theatrical way, she had left behind a trail of truth, through notes, through gestures, through one last séance that had revealed more than anyone realized. Miss Marple recalled Portia's voice. "There's a gate, something buried, a name that cast shadows."
And so it had.
The next morning, Miss Marple received a letter. Unadorned, unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably Dorothea Crane's. "Dear Miss Marple, thank you for seeing what I could not, or would not. I do not know yet where I'm going, only that it must be away from all this.
Perhaps that is cowardice. Or perhaps it is the first brave thing I have ever done. Please keep the book I left in your porch. Portia gave it to me years ago.
I believe it was meant for you." With quiet gratitude, Miss Marple stepped onto the porch and found a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside lay a copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Between its pages was a pressed gardenia and a single sheet of cream stationery. In Portia's hand, "The past is patient, but it never forgets. For those who see clearly, truth is always present. You see more than most, dear Miss Marple. That is your gift, and perhaps your burden."
P.W. Miss Marple closed the book gently and set it beside her tea tray.
Justice had come to Little Skeleton, quietly, inevitably, without fanfare.
Only consequence. The wind had shifted in Little Skeleton.
No longer did it carry the faint tension that had lingered since the séance. Instead, there was a hush of acceptance, the silence that follows the last bell toll, when nothing more can be said though everything still remains to be felt. A week had passed since Martin Crane's arrest, and already the village was adjusting. Conversations drifted back toward harvest suppers, vicarage rotas, and the threat of a hard winter. Yet beneath those familiar rhythms lay the shape of something unspoken. In her sitting room, Miss Marple sipped her tea and opened the envelope that had arrived from Heathmay Crown Court that morning. As promised, Inspector Welsh had enclosed the formal confirmation of Martin Crane's signed confession, along with a summary of the findings. She read the evidence listed: the scarf recovered near the well, the laboratory proof of belladonna in the residue of the decoy vial, and the corroboration of the destroyed will by Mr. Crane's full admission, signed before 2 witnesses. He has pled guilty to the murder of Portia Wellborn and is to be remanded in custody pending sentencing. The matter of Cornelius Sneed's death has been formally reopened. A second note, handwritten in Welsh's firm script, followed. Miss Marple, I would very much like to know how you saw it all before I did. Gratefully, She smiled faintly and slipped the letter into the side of her writing desk. There was no pride in being right, only the weight of responsibility.
She had simply done what needed to be done. That was all.
Later that day, as clouds gathered once more along the rim of the hills, Elise came to call. She looked easier now, the taut line of worry across her brow softened. "They've agreed to let me stay on at the vicarage until I find another position," she said. "The Reverend's wife is teaching me to keep accounts."
Miss Marple nodded approvingly.
"You're a clever girl, Elise. You'll make something for yourself, I'm sure." Elise hesitated, then drew a folded letter from her pocket.
"I wasn't certain whether to give this to you before," she said quietly. "I found it in the hidden compartment, Portia's desk. I think it was meant for you." Miss Marple unfolded the letter carefully.
"My dear Miss Marple, if you are reading this, then I have either succeeded in making some difference, or I have paid the cost of trying. Either way, I imagine the truth has been uncovered. And if so, I owe it to your eyes, which see so very far beneath the surface. I came to Little Skeleton not merely for peace, but for reckoning. I had questions about Martin and Dorothea, and about others as well.
Perhaps I meddled too deeply. Perhaps it was never mine to solve. But I could not turn from shadows once I had glimpsed them.
If I am gone, please be certain that what I uncovered is not buried with me. And, if you can, offer mercy to those who feared the truth. Fear is the real poison, you see. Yours in watchfulness, Portia W." Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it back in Elise's hand.
"Thank you, my dear," she said softly.
"That is exactly what I needed."
After Elise departed, the rain began.
A steady patter misted the windows and blurred the world beyond. Miss Marple sat near the fire, the slow ticking of the mantel clock the only sound in the room. She reviewed every detail one last time, as she always did.
Portia's séance had not summoned spirits, it had summoned truth.
Each guest had carried a private fear. Some had left theirs behind. Others had been caught in its snare. The scarf, the poisoned vial, the will, the missing hour during the séance, the anonymous note that guided her to the garden well, each thread had tugged softly, never shouting, only humming beneath the surface of the village until the pattern revealed itself, until Martin Crane's mask fractured.
It had not been theatrical. Miss Marple had not raised her voice, nor pointed her finger.
She had simply waited, observed, and when Martin's fear grew too loud to be contained, he had betrayed himself.
She had merely watched the unraveling. Now, no threads remained.
Emmeline Sneed's locket had been returned unopened. Lionel Kent had quietly shut his practice and gone to his cousins in Wiltshire.
Harold Greaves resumed his river walks, no longer shadowed.
Beatrice Fletton departed for Devon 2 days later, her trunk strapped to a mail cart. Miss Marple received no further anonymous letters, no midnight knocks, no unlooked-for visitors.
Fern Hollow stood empty once more.
At dusk she lit a single candle and placed it by the window, not from superstition, but from habit. The flame, she thought, had always drawn moths, but it also offered direction, a quiet beacon for anyone lost in fog. The truth had been found, and the story, at last, was the end.